He didn't make a sound when they rode off without him. Didn't shout. Didn't chase the wagon down the hill. Didn't call out the name of a single person on it. He just stood there at the edge of the Cimarron Road, 53 years old, with a broken rib taped under his shirt and $4.11 to his name, and he watched the Holcomb outfit disappear into the dust like they'd never existed. The girl was beside him. She was 10 years old, and she was holding a flour sack that had someone else's initials stitched on it, and she did not cry either. Her name was Clara Voss. She had brown eyes and a gap between her two front teeth, and she had been passed between 4 different families in the New Mexico Territory since she was 6, and she had learned not to cry in front of strangers because crying made them uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people made worse decisions about where to put you next. The man standing beside her was called Emmett Greer. She did not know him well. She had known him for 11 days, which was how long she had been riding with the Holcomb outfit, before the Holcombs decided they were done with both of them for different reasons, and left them on a dirt road 60 miles from the nearest town. She had a name for. Emmett stood on that road and looked at the horizon the Holcombs had become, and he thought several things in fast succession. He thought about the rib, which made breathing an exercise in careful management. He thought about the $4.11, which was not enough for much of anything. He thought about the girl standing beside him with her flour sack and her dry eyes and her particular stillness, the kind of stillness that is not calm, but is something that used to be panic and has been compressed into something quieter and more durable. Then he stopped thinking about his own situation and looked at hers. "You hungry?" he said. She considered the question like it might be a trap. Then she said, "Some." He reached into his coat pocket and found the heel of a biscuit he'd wrapped in cloth that morning and forgotten about. He handed it to her. She took it without thanking him, which he did not hold against her. She ate it in 4 bites and looked at the road. "There's a town called Red Bend about 16 miles east," Emmett said. "Came through it 2 years back. It's got a livery, a general store, a doctor's office, and a woman who runs a boarding house." He paused. "We start walking now. We make it before dark." The girl looked at the road going east and then at the road going west and then at him. She had the look of someone performing rapid arithmetic. "You know somebody in Red Bend," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," he said. "Then why are we going there instead of somewhere else?" "Because I know where it is," he said. "That's more than I can say for anywhere else right now." She picked up her flour sack. "All right," she said. They walked. The rib made itself known with every uneven step, and Emmett managed it the same way he had managed the previous 11 days of it, which was by keeping his breathing shallow and his attention on what was in front of him. He was not a man given to complaint. He had been a deputy marshal in Tucson for 9 years before a horse fell on him wrong and ended that, and before that he had been a great many other things, and not one of those things had left him with much patience for the sound of his own grievances. The girl walked without talking. She kept pace with him exactly, which he noticed because most children either fell behind or ran ahead, and she did neither. She matched him step for step and watched the country around them the way someone watches country they have learned not to trust. "What happened to your family?" he said after a while. He said it the same way he would have asked what town she was from. Plain and direct, without gentleness in it, because he had found in his experience that gentleness around that particular question usually made it worse. She was quiet for a count of 10. Then she said, "Cholera, 3 years ago. My mother first, and then my father 6 days later." She paused. "The Alcott family took me after that. Then the Pierces. Then a woman named Mrs. Fenn who decided she was moving to California and didn't want to bring me. Then the Holcombs." Emmett absorbed this. "How long were you with the Holcombs?" 11 days, she said. "Same as me," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Why'd they leave you?" Emmett considered how much of this was worth explaining to a 10-year-old. Then he decided she'd probably heard worse. "I told Holcomb his foreman was skimming the cattle count and selling the difference to a buyer in Tucson. Holcomb didn't want to hear it. I kept saying it anyway." Clara thought about this. "Were you right?" "Yes." She nodded like that settled something. They walked another mile before she said, "My father used to say that being right and being useful aren't always the same thing." Emmett looked at her. "How old are you?" 10. "Your father was a smart man." She didn't answer that, but something around her eyes shifted, briefly, and then went still again. They made Red Bend, just before sundown. It was a small town doing its best with limited materials. A main street of 8 buildings, a water trough with a cracked side leaking slowly into the dust, 2 horses at the rail outside the saloon, who looked as tired as everything else. But it had a boarding house, just as Emmett remembered, and the woman who ran it was named Ruth Cade, and she came to the door when he knocked and looked at the two of them with the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world to not be surprised by much of it. Emmett explained the situation plainly. He had $4.11. He had a broken rib. The girl had nowhere to go. He was looking for work and a place to stay while he found it, and he was asking for the girl to be included in that arrangement. Ruth Cade looked at Clara for a long moment. Clara looked back without flinching. "She doesn't talk much," Emmett said. "She talks fine," Clara said. "I'm just choosing not to right now." Ruth Cade's expression did something small and complicated. Then she opened the door wider and said, "Supper's in an hour. There's a room off the back that needs the window fixed. You fix it. It pays for the first 2 nights." "Yes, ma'am," Emmett said. He fixed the window that evening with his left side turned away from the work to protect the rib and finished before the supper bell. Clara sat on the back step and watched him work and handed him things when he needed them without being asked, and he noticed she anticipated correctly every time, passing the hammer before he reached for it, holding the glass in place while he secured the frame. "You've done work like this before," he said. "Every family I stayed with needed something," she said. "You learn what's useful." He looked at her over his shoulder. "What's useful to you?" he said. "What do you want to learn?" She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Numbers," she said. "And reading, which I already know some. And how to know when someone is lying." He turned back to the window. "That last one's worth more than the first 2 put together," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you teach me?" He set the hammer down and tested the window frame. He thought about his $4.11 and his broken rib and the fact that he was 53 years old and had no particular plans and nothing that constituted a reason to stay in Red Bend except that he hadn't yet found a reason to leave. "We'll see," he said. He found work inside a week. Not the work he would have chosen, but the work that was available, which was bookkeeping for a man named Theodore Pratt, who ran the general store and the feed operation and a small loan business, and kept records in a system so disorganized it constituted a kind of financial self-destruction. Emmett could read a ledger and find its errors, which was a skill Pratt needed badly enough to overlook the broken rib and the lack of a permanent address. Clara stayed at the boarding house with Ruth Cade during the days. She was useful there in the way she was useful everywhere, quiet and observant and capable of doing what needed doing without being directed twice. Ruth was not a warm woman, but she was a fair one, and she left Clara alone in the way that Clara seemed to need to be left alone, which was not entirely alone, but alone in the sense that no one was pushing her. In the evenings, Emmett came back to the boarding house and sat with Clara at the kitchen table and taught her what he'd promised. Numbers first. She was faster at arithmetic than he expected, running calculations in her head before he finished writing the problem down, and checking her answers with the same methodical patience she brought to everything. "How do you do that?" he said one evening, watching her add a column of figures without writing anything. "I see them," she said. "Like they're already sitting in a row waiting." He considered this. "Where did you learn numbers?" "My father," she said. "He was a surveyor. He used to take me out with him and let me read the instruments." She paused. "I liked how the numbers meant something real, distance and elevation, and how much land there was between 2 points." She looked at the slate between them. "Numbers always tell the truth. People don't always. Numbers do." Emmett thought about that for a long time after she went to sleep. He had been in Red Bend 3 months when he first heard the name Aldous Crane. It came through Pratt's books, a name on a loan document dated 8 months prior, a piece of land in the hills east of Red Bend used as collateral, a repayment schedule that looked reasonable until you read it carefully and saw that the interest structure, buried in the 3rd paragraph, made it nearly impossible to satisfy under normal conditions. The land was a small cattle operation called Sunridge, owned by a family named Wakefield. Emmett brought it to Pratt's attention carefully, because Theodore Pratt was a man who required careful handling, the kind of man who took information as a personal accusation if it was not delivered with sufficient deference. "This loan structure," Emmett said, setting the ledger page in front of Pratt. The Wakefield note. The compounding clause here. This isn't standard practice. Pratt looked at it. Then he looked at Emmett. Mr. Crane structured that himself, he said. He does most of the lending in this county. Emmett waited. He's a businessman, Pratt said. He operates within the law. Within it, Emmett agreed. Close to the edge of it in some places. Pratt took the ledger back. Mr. Greer, he said, you were hired to organize these books, not evaluate the ethics of their contents. Emmett said nothing else, but he remembered the Wakefield name. He heard it again 2 weeks later from Ruth Cade, who mentioned it the way people in small towns mention things they've been turning over privately sideways during another conversation, as if it might slip past the part of the listener that would ask follow-up questions. The Wakefield girl was in town this morning, Ruth said, looking piqued. Henry Wakefield's been trying to sell the north parcel to cover the loan, but Crane won't accept a partial payment against the balance, wants the whole note cleared at once. Emmett looked up from his coffee. Can't do that, Ruth said, answering his expression. Nobody's got that kind of cash money sitting loose. That's the point of the loan being structured the way it's structured. She was quiet for a moment. Crane's been after Sunridge for 2 years. The Wakefields have been there for 12. Clara was sitting at the far end of the kitchen table with her slate, and Emmett had long ago learned that Clara's stillness during adult conversations was not inattention. It was documentation. She absorbed everything. That evening, she pushed her slate across the table to him. On it, she had written, if the interest compounds monthly on the full principal regardless of payment, the debt grows faster than it can be paid. That's not a loan. That's a trap. Emmett looked at the slate. Then he looked at her. You've been reading Pratt's ledgers, he said. You leave them on the table, she said, with a reasonableness that was difficult to argue with. I read what's in front of me. She pointed to the calculation on the slate. Am I wrong? No, he said. You're not wrong. She pulled the slate back and wiped it clean with the methodical care she brought to everything. Then she said, are you going to do something about it? He sat with that question for a long time. He thought about Pratt's warning about evaluating ethics. He thought about his 4 remaining dollars after expenses, now grown to 19 through careful management and 2 months of wages. He thought about being 53 years old with a partially healed rib and no particular claim on anybody's situation. Then he looked at Clara, who had put children's faces together from 4 different families and still showed up every morning and did the work in front of her without complaint. And he thought about the Wakefields, who had built something for 12 years only to have it consumed by a document they had signed in good faith. I'm going to find out what can be done, he said. He rode out to Sunridge on a Sunday. He told no one but Ruth, who told him to be careful in a tone that suggested she had already formed her own opinions about Aldous Crane. The Wakefield place was exactly what the name suggested, a ridge property with good south-facing grass and a creek running through the lower section that fed the grazing land in a way that made the whole operation viable. It was well kept in the way that things are kept when people intend to stay. Henry Wakefield met him at the fence line with a wariness that had become habitual. He was a lean, sun-darkened man in his mid-40s who had the posture of someone carrying a load he hadn't set down in long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight. His wife, Margaret, stood at the house door and watched. Emmett introduced himself and stated his purpose plainly, the way he had always stated things. He had read the loan documents in Pratt's ledgers. He was not there on Pratt's behalf. He was there because the structure of the note was irregular, and he had spent 9 years as a deputy marshal identifying irregularities for a living, and this one warranted attention. Wakefield looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the bookkeeper." "I'm the bookkeeper," Emmett confirmed. "Why do you care about my note?" Emmett thought about the best answer to that. Then he gave the true one. "Because I read it and I know what it means, and you may not know everything it means, and I think you deserve to." They sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, and Emmett went through the document clause by clause. He watched Henry Wakefield's face as the full architecture of it became visible, the compounding structure that guaranteed escalation. The cross-collateral clause that meant a default on any payment put the entire property at risk. The arbitration provision that removed the territorial court from the process and put dispute resolution in the hands of a single appointed mediator, who Emmett would not have been surprised to learn was someone Crane selected himself. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Margaret Wakefield, who had not spoken, said, "We didn't understand it when we signed." "Nobody does," Emmett said. That's deliberate. Henry Wakefield looked at the document and then at Emmett. What can we do? Emmett had been thinking about this since Clara's slate. I want to show this to a lawyer, he said. Not in Red Bend. In Santa Fe. A territorial attorney who doesn't have connections to Crane. He paused. The arbitration clause may not be enforceable under territorial law. I need someone qualified to read it that way. If the clause fails, you're back in front of a proper court, and a judge reading this compound structure will see what it is. It costs money to get a lawyer in Santa Fe, Henry said. I know, Emmett said. We'll figure that out. He was not sure exactly what he meant by we. He noted the word after it came out of his mouth and noticed that the Wakefields both noticed it, and he did not correct it. Clara was awake when he came back to the boarding house. She was at the kitchen table with a candle and her slate, and she looked up when he came in with the expression she had whenever she had been waiting and was too composed to admit it. Well, she said. He told her. All of it. He was not accustomed to briefing a 10-year-old as if she were a colleague. But Clara listened, without interruption, asked 2 questions when he was done, one about the arbitration clause and one about the cross-collateral provision, and then said, You need to know if Crane has done this before, not just to the Wakefields. If there's a pattern, it changes what a judge sees. Emmett looked at her across the candle. How do you figure that? Because a single bad loan looks like a contract dispute, she said. A pattern looks like fraud. Those are different things in court. He was quiet for a moment. And how do you know that? She pointed to the shelf across the kitchen where Ruth Cade kept a small collection of books. Third one from the left, she said. It's a legal digest from 1871. I've been reading it on Thursdays when you're at Pratt's late. Emmett turned and looked at the shelf. Third from the left was, indeed, a worn brown volume he had never paid attention to. He turned back to Clara. You've been reading a legal digest for pleasure, he said. I've been reading it for information, she said, as if this distinction were obvious. She looked at the slate, where she had written a list of names. Pratt's ledgers have 4 other Crane loans. I wrote down the names. He looked at the slate. Then he looked at the girl behind it, this 10-year-old child with her gap-toothed seriousness and her flour sack of belongings, and her 4 families who had each failed to see what was sitting in front of them. He thought about the legal digest, and the mental arithmetic, and the particular patience she brought to every problem she encountered. Clara, he said. She looked up. You're not going back to a placement family, he said. Not if I can help it. She was very still. Then she said, You don't have any standing to decide that. That's the territory's decision. I know it, he said. But I can work on it. She looked at him for a long moment with the same measuring quality. She had turned on everything since the road outside Red Bend. Then she said, All right, and she went back to the slate. The next 3 months were the hardest work of Emmett Greer's life, and he had a fairly long list of hard work to compare against. He started by visiting each of the 4 other names on Clara's list families who had borrowed from Aldous Crane and were at various stages of the same compound trap the Wakefields were in. He went quietly, on his own time, on Sundays and occasional evenings, and he brought with him a plain explanation of what the documents meant, and a notebook where he wrote down everything each family told him about their dealings with Crane. Clara organized the notebook. This was her own initiative. He came back from the second visit to find the notes. From the first visit, recopied in her clear, even handwriting, indexed by family name and loan date, with a column she had added herself, tracking the gap between what each family thought they owed and what the compound structure actually produced. That gap column, he said when he saw it. It shows the difference between the loan as explained and the loan as written, she said. That's the fraud part. He looked at the column for a long time. How long did this take you? About 2 hours, she said. I also found something in the Red Bend land records. Ruth has a copy of the county registry, and I've been looking at property transfers. She turned the notebook to a page she had flagged with a strip of cloth. 3 of the 5 families borrowed from Crane within a year of him acquiring adjacent property. She pointed to the dates. He buys land near them, then loans to them. When the loan defaults, he gets their land. He's been building a connected parcel. She traced a line between names on the page. If you put all 5 properties together, plus what he already owns, it's the largest continuous water access in this part of the territory. Emmett sat down. The creek that runs through Sunridge, she said, It connects to two other watercourses on properties he's already acquired. The Wakefield's water is the last piece. Without it, what he's building is incomplete. With it, he controls water for about 30,000 acres. He looked at her. How long have you been working on this? She considered. 3 weeks, she said. Since you came back from the second visit. I didn't say anything until I was sure. He thought about the 9 years he had spent identifying patterns for the U.S. Marshal's office. He thought about the months it had taken experienced men to map similar schemes in much smaller operations. Are you sure now? He said. Yes, she said, and pulled out 3 more pages she had kept separate, each one a clean copy of a relevant land record, each one annotated in her hand with dates and acquisition prices, and the names of the attorneys who had filed the paperwork. He stared at the pages. Where did you get these? The county land office keeps copies. Ruth took me on Tuesday. I told the clerk I was doing schoolwork. She paused. That was mostly true. Emmett laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in a while, and it surprised him. Clara watched him with the cautious expression of someone who is not used to adults laughing near her and is not yet sure how to read it. He wrote to a territorial attorney in Santa Fe that week. A man named Harlan Webb, who had been recommended by a former colleague of Emmett's from the Marshal's days, recommended not for his comfort, but for his competence, which was considerable and not available cheaply. Emmett explained the situation in 3 pages, included Clara's pattern analysis, and asked what could be done and what it would cost. Webb's reply came 2 weeks later. It was 2 pages long, precise, and without comfort. What had been documented was serious and potentially actionable. The arbitration clause, as Emmett had suspected, was likely unenforceable under territorial statute. Webb cited the specific provision. The fraud case, if it could be built properly, would require sworn testimony from the affected families, documented evidence of the pattern, and a formal filing with the Territorial Land Office that would trigger an investigation. The cost was more than Emmett had. It was more than all 5 families combined had available in cash. Emmett read the letter twice. Then he brought it to Clara, who read it once and said, "You need more than one lawyer." "What do you mean?" "Crane has lawyers, multiple lawyers. If you file against him, and he brings 3 attorneys against one, the case drowns in procedure." She paused. But if 5 families file separately, and the Territorial Land Office is also investigating, Crane has to defend on multiple fronts at the same time. His lawyers can't be everywhere. Emmett looked at the letter. She had seen in 30 seconds what had taken him 2 readings. "That's going to take coordination," he said. "I know," she said. "Who talks to the families?" He looked at her. "I've met them," she said quietly. "When you went to explain the documents, I came with you twice. The Wakefield family, the Odom family. I talked to their children. Their parents remember me." He knew she had come. He had not fully registered, until this moment, what she had been doing during those visits. She had not been waiting outside. She had been inside, at the kitchen tables, quiet and present and storing everything. "You've been doing this the whole time," he said. "I've been learning," she said. "Like you said." She met his eyes. "I'd like to help do it." He sat with that for a long time. He thought about what it meant to ask a 10-year-old girl to be part of a legal strategy against a man with resources and connections, and no particular regard for people who stood in his way. He thought about what it meant to not ask her, which was to pretend she was not already in it. "We need 3 things," she said. He hadn't asked, but she had been ready. He waited. "We need the families to hold," she said. "Not sell, not settle, not talk to Crane's people outside of what gets documented. We need everything in writing before it moves. And we need the Territorial Land Office to see the water pattern before Crane files anything else. If he acquires one more piece, it looks like normal business. If we show them the shape of it before the last piece lands, it looks like what it is." "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. She looked at him with something that was not quite a child's expression. "You spend 4 years being moved around between families," she said, "and you learn to read a situation before it moves. You learn what's about to happen, and you get ready before it does." She paused. "This isn't different. It's just bigger." Emmett Greer, who had ridden for 9 years with the Marshal's service and seen a considerable range of human capability, sat in a boarding house kitchen in Red Bend, New Mexico Territory, with a 10-year-old girl across the table from him and a notebook full of land records and loan documents between them, and he thought, She is the most useful person I have met in 30 years of work. He did not say that. He said, "All right, let's build it." They built it in 8 weeks, Clara wrote to the Wakefield family. She had asked Emmett whether she should sign the letters herself or through him, and he had said, "Sign them yourself." She wrote in her even, deliberate, careful letters, direct and specific, laying out in plain language what the pattern showed and what each family needed to do, and when, and in what order. She included with each letter a copy of the relevant land record comparison and a plain explanation of what the arbitration clause meant and why it mattered. Margaret Wakefield sent a reply after 3 days. She had shown the letter to her neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Dunbar, whose husband had also borrowed from Crane. The Dunbars had not been on Clara's original list. They had been too afraid to speak when Emmett visited the other families. The letter from a 10-year-old girl, Margaret wrote, had somehow done what a grown man's visit had not. Clara read the reply and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Women talk to each other differently than men do." Emmett thought about that. He thought about it for the rest of the day. The 7th week was the worst. Aldous Crane appeared in Red Bend on a Thursday, which was not his usual pattern, and he visited Pratt's store for an hour, which Emmett observed through the front window from across the street. Crane was a compact, well-dressed man of around 60, who had the easy movement of someone who had never needed to hurry because the terrain had always arranged itself in advance of his arrival. He spoke to Pratt for an hour behind a closed door and left without appearing to rush. Pratt came to find Emmett that afternoon. "I'm going to need to let you go at the end of the month," Pratt said. He didn't look at Emmett when he said it. His bookkeeping needs have changed. Emmett looked at him steadily. Pratt's face was doing the thing faces do when a person is ashamed of a decision they are going to make anyway. "Understood," Emmett said. He walked back to the boarding house. He told Ruth. He told Clara. Clara said, "How much time do we have?" 3 weeks, he said. She pulled the notebook toward her. "Then we file in 2, she said. "So it moves before he can do anything about you losing the job." She looked up. "Does this change anything?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. She nodded and went back to the notebook. On the 2nd Saturday of the 8th week, Emmett rode to Santa Fe with every document they had assembled: land records, loan analyses, the family statements he had taken down in writing and had each family sign, Clara's pattern documentation, and a cover letter to the Territorial Land Office that Clara had drafted and he had revised once for language that might read as too young, although he had changed less than he expected. Harlan Webb met him in Santa Fe and read everything. He read Clara's water pattern analysis twice. Then he looked at Emmett and said, "Who put this together?" "A 10-year-old girl," Emmett said. Webb looked at him. "She reads ledgers for entertainment," Emmett said. "And a legal digest she found on a shelf." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The pattern analysis is what makes this prosecutable rather than just actionable. Without it, you have 5 separate contract disputes. With it, you have a coordinated fraud scheme." He set the papers down. "This is thorough. She's thorough," Emmett said. Webb filed the complaint with the Territorial Land Office that afternoon and the formal proceeding with the court the following morning, before Crane's attorneys in Santa Fe had any reason to be watching for it. They were back in Red Bend by Tuesday. The waiting was difficult. Emmett was better at waiting than most people. The Marshal's work had required it. Clara managed it by working, which he recognized as her primary strategy for most things. She helped Ruth around the boarding house, and she read, and she kept the notebook updated, and she went over the land records again looking for things she might have missed. She found one. "Emmett," she said, on the 4th day of waiting. She set the notebook in front of him. "The Red Bend land records show a filing from 6 weeks ago. Crane transferred one of his adjacent parcels to a business entity called the Cimarron Land Consortium." She pointed to the filing date. "The business entity was registered in Texas 2 months before the transfer." She paused. "I don't think it's real." "What do you mean?" "I mean, it might just be Crane's money behind a different name. If he's moving property out of his own name before the investigation gets to him, it complicates things." She looked at him. "Can you tell Webb?" He wrote to Webb that evening. Webb replied, "In 4 days." The Cimarron Land Consortium was indeed a shell arrangement. Clara's observation had been made just in time. Webb filed an additional document with the court preserving the properties within the complaint's scope. A girl, Webb wrote in the margin of his reply, who reads land transfer filings 6 weeks old to spot a shell company deserves more than 10 years old. Emmett read that line twice. Then he folded the letter and put it in the notebook. The territorial investigator arrived in Red Bend 42 days after the filing. His name was James Aldcott. He was a methodical man who interviewed everyone in sequence and wrote everything down and gave no indication at any point of what he was concluding. He sat with Emmett for 2 hours. He sat with Henry Wakefield for an afternoon. He sat with all 5 families over 3 days. On the 4th morning, he asked to speak with whoever had prepared the written documentation. Emmett brought Clara. Aldcott looked at her for a moment with the same recalibration expression she had seen before. Then he sat across from her and asked her questions for 90 minutes, specifically and seriously, and she answered with the same precision she brought to everything. At the end, he said, "How did you identify the water pattern connection?" "I drew a map," she said, "with all the properties and the water sources. When you look at them together, the pattern is obvious. It's only invisible if you look at each piece separately." Aldcott looked at her. "Who taught you to look at things that way?" She glanced at Emmett briefly. Then she said, "I taught myself, mostly." Emmett, to his own surprise, felt something move in his chest that he would not have been able to name easily, but that had something to do with the word mostly and what it meant that she had included it. Aldcott concluded his investigation 21 days later. The findings were substantial. Aldous Crane was formally charged with fraudulent loan structuring and coordinated land acquisition through misrepresentation. All 5 loans were suspended pending court review. The Cimarron Land Consortium transfers were voided as fraudulent conveyances. A criminal referral was made to the U.S. Marshal's office, which was, Emmett noted with some private satisfaction, a body he was not entirely unfamiliar with. Henry Wakefield came into Red Bend the day the findings were published and shook Emmett's hand for a long time without saying much. Margaret Wakefield hugged Clara, who endured it with the slightly stiff dignity of a person not entirely accustomed to being hugged. Mrs. Dunbar, the neighbor Margaret had brought in from outside the original list, sent a jar of preserves to the boarding house with a note that said, "You tell that little girl she saved our farm." Clara read the note. She folded it and put it in her flour sack, which had become a repository of things she considered worth keeping. Ruth Cade made a particular supper that evening, the kind of supper that required advanced preparation and communicated without announcement that it was a celebration. Emmett sat across from Clara, and they ate, and said less than the occasion might have required in words, but enough in everything else. Near the end of supper, Clara said, "What happens to me now?" She said it plainly, without drama, the same way she had asked everything, but he heard the particular weight in it, the question she had been not asking for months. Emmett had been working on this since the Creek Bank conversation. He had written to the Territorial Children's Office in Santa Fe 6 weeks ago, before the filing, as a parallel process. He had documented his employment, his situation, his intention. He had asked Harlan Webb to include a character reference in the package without explaining why to Clara. He had asked Ruth Cade for a statement, which she had given in writing and also in person to the territorial officer when Aldcott's visit overlapped with an unrelated inquiry. He put an envelope on the table between them. "The territorial office approved a formal guardianship arrangement," he said. "My name on the paperwork." "Yours on the paperwork?" He paused. "It's not permanent until a judge signs it in Santa Fe, but it's moving." Clara looked at the envelope. She didn't open it. "You did this before we knew how the case would come out," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because the case had nothing to do with it," he said. He looked at her directly. "You needed a place that wasn't going to change based on how something else went. That's the whole point." She looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she looked at him. Outside, Red Bend was doing its ordinary evening things. Horses at the rail, a door closing somewhere down the street, the particular quiet of a small town settling into night. She picked up the envelope and held it. She didn't open it, but she held it in both hands, carefully, the way she held things she intended to keep. "All right," she said. 2 words, but the weight of them filled the room. The court date in Santa Fe came 6 weeks later. Emmett and Clara rode the 2 days together, and she asked questions the entire first day, about legal procedure and what judges looked for and how the Crane defense would likely argue, and he answered everything he knew and told her plainly when he didn't know. On the second evening, camped off the main road, she asked him something different. "Were you scared?" she said, "when you told Holcomb about his foreman, knowing he'd probably leave you on the road?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "I'd been scared of worse things." He paused. "Were you scared? On the road that day?" She looked at the fire. "Yes," she said. "But I decided it wasn't useful, so I stopped." He looked at her sideways. "You decided. You can decide things," she said. "Not all things, but more things than people think." She poked at the fire with a stick. "That's what I figured out between the Alcotts and the Pierces. You can decide what you do with the things that happen to you. You can't always decide the things themselves." Emmett sat with that. He thought about a road outside Red Bend, and a girl with a flour sack and dry eyes, and the internal arithmetic of someone deciding what to do with the worst version of her situation. "You were deciding already," he said. "On the road." She looked at him briefly, then back at the fire. "I was deciding whether you were someone I could trust," she said. "I was watching how you thought about the problem." He almost said, "What did you conclude?" But he thought he knew the answer, and he thought she knew he knew it, and neither of them needed to say it aloud. The hearing in Santa Fe lasted 2 days. Crane's attorneys were expensive and thorough, and they challenged the standing of the documentation, the competence of the process, the interpretation of the loan structure. The territorial judge was a deliberate man who asked many questions and showed nothing on his face until the second afternoon, when Crane's lead attorney suggested for the third time that the fraud interpretation was a misreading of standard commercial practice. The judge looked at the documentation on his desk. He looked at the 5 family testimonies, each one signed and dated. He looked at the water pattern analysis, which was attached as a separate exhibit and had been prepared by a 10-year-old in a boarding house kitchen in Red Bend using publicly available land records. He said, "Counsel, the pattern documented here is not ambiguous. I'd ask you not to suggest otherwise again." Crane's attorney did not suggest it again. The finding took 9 days. Crane's loans were voided as fraudulently structured. The Cimarron Land Consortium transfers were permanently reversed. Crane faced a criminal proceeding before the U.S. Marshal's office. The 5 families kept their land. The Territorial Land Office opened a review of 6 additional Crane transactions predating the current case, involving families neither Emmett nor Clara had ever met. Henry Wakefield sent a letter when the finding came through. He wrote it to both of them, addressing Clara by name with the same weight he gave to Emmett's. 3 sentences for each of them, and a separate sentence at the end that said, "I don't think we would have held without those letters." Clara read the letter twice. She folded it and put it in the flour sack alongside the Dunbar note, the court filing confirmation, and one other thing Emmett had watched her put in there weeks ago, and had not asked about the original letter he had written to the Territorial Children's Office. She had found it in his coat. She had not said anything. She had put it in the sack. On the ride home to Red Bend, she was quieter than usual, which he had learned meant she was processing something at depth, rather than that nothing was happening. On the second afternoon, on the same stretch of road where they had camped before, she said, "When the judge signs it in Santa Fe, the guardianship," he waited. "I want to learn land law," she said, "properly. I mean from a person who knows it, not from a digest on a shelf." He thought about Webb, who had mentioned at the close of the hearing that the Territorial Attorney's Office occasionally took on apprentices. He thought about the letter Webb had written in the margin. He thought about what a girl, who read land transfer filings and spotted shell companies at 10 years old, might become by the time she was 25, given the right tools and a long enough runway. "I'll write to Webb," he said. She nodded. She looked at the road ahead, wide and dusty, and entirely manageable. They rode into Red Bend on a Thursday. Ruth Cade was at the door when they came through, and she looked at their faces and said, "Well?" "Done," Emmett said. Ruth nodded. She looked at Clara. "There's bread that needs looking at." Clara got down from the horse and handed her reins to Emmett without ceremony and went inside. He could hear Ruth's voice beginning to explain something about bread and the specific wrong way to test it, and then Clara's voice responding with a question, precise and serious, because Clara approached everything she was learning the same way, entirely and without pretense. He stood in the yard for a moment. The evening was settling in around Red Bend in its ordinary way. Nothing changed, and everything different. And he held both horses and listened to the voices in the kitchen, and thought about a road west of here, months ago, and a girl standing in the dust with a flour sack and dry eyes, and the entire weight of everything that had happened to her, carried quietly inside, already deciding what to do with it. They had thrown her away because they couldn't see what she was. She had always known exactly what she was. And she had waited, patient as a surveyor reading instruments, for someone to hand her the tools and get out of the way. He tied the horses and went inside. Sometimes the world moves you from place to place like something without a home, and it's easy to believe that means you have no worth. But Clara and Emmett found each other on a dusty road with nothing between them but honesty and a willingness to look clearly at what needed doing, and that was enough to build everything. The people who matter most aren't always the ones who chose you first. Sometimes they're the ones who choose you when it counts. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, and to leave behind one small truth worth carrying with you.